MRI in the Soviet Union of the 1930s, life seemed normal on the surface. Factories roared, propaganda posters covered the streets, and the voice of Joseph Stalin echoed on radios across the country. But behind that facade of strength and unity, there existed a machine of terror unlike anything the world had ever seen. That machine was the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. The NKVD was not just a law enforcement agency. To live in Stalin's Russia was to live with the knowledge that at any moment, day or night, a knock on your door could end your life as you knew it. The Great Terror, as it would later be called, was designed not only to crush Stalin's enemies, but also to instill total obedience. The NKVD drew up lists of suspects, which often included loyal communists, writers, generals, engineers, and even ordinary workers. The accusations were often absurd: plotting against the revolution, spying for foreign powers, or even criticizing Stalin's leadership. No evidence was needed. A single whisper from a neighbor could seal your fate. By 1937, arrests were happening on a massive scale. People vanished overnight, dragged from their homes in black cars known as Black Marias. Families often never saw them again. One day, a man might be working in his office. The next day, his desk was empty, and no one dared to ask why. Fear ran so deep that even children were not safe. Students were encouraged to report on their parents. Friends turned on friends. Husbands were forced to denounce their wives. Stalin's power was absolute because the NKVD had made the entire population prisoners of fear. And yet, the most chilling part of this system was not only the brutality, but its efficiency. Tens of thousands were processed each week. Trials, if they happened, were little more than theater. Quick, scripted, and meaningless. Sentences were decided before the accused even entered the courtroom. But what happened to those who vanished? Where were they taken? Some ended up in gulag labor camps scattered across Siberia. Others faced execution squads in secret cellars, where gunshots were muffled by the roar of engines. Many simply disappeared without a trace, leaving families to spend decades searching for answers that never came. The NKVD did not just kill individuals. It destroyed trust, community, and even love. To survive, people kept silent. They pretended not to notice when neighbors disappeared. They tore up photographs of enemies of the state, afraid that even an old family picture could bring suspicion. By the end of the Great Terror, historians estimate that nearly 1 million people were executed, and millions more were sent to gulags. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's shadow, had become a nation of whispers, fear, and unmarked graves. But this was only the beginning, because what happened next would show that Stalin's terror had no limits, not even for his closest allies. A car without markings, painted black, its windows dark, rolled quietly down the street. Neighbors peeked through curtains, then quickly shut them, pretending not to see, because everyone knew what came next. The Black Maria had arrived. Inside the house, a family sat frozen. A knock thundered on the door, 3 sharp raps. Not the knock of a neighbor, not the knock of a friend. This was the knock of the NKVD. For the person inside, time seemed to stop. Their heart raced, their mouth went dry, because everyone understood that when the secret police came at night, it meant one thing. Someone in that house was about to disappear. The officers were cold, efficient, and merciless. They carried lists, typed sheets of names prepared in Stalin's offices. To them, the accused were not people, but numbers. They would read aloud, "You are under arrest for crimes against the state." No explanation, no chance to argue. The accused was often given only minutes, sometimes only seconds, to gather their belongings. Many did not even have that. Some were dragged away barefoot in night clothes, children screaming behind them. The rest of the family was ordered to stay silent. To speak, to protest, to beg, it was dangerous, because anyone who tried could be taken too. And then the car vanished into the night, just as quickly as it had arrived. By dawn, the street was silent again. But the neighbors knew. They always knew. One more door closed forever. One more family broken. What awaited those taken was even more terrifying. First came interrogation. Days, sometimes weeks of brutal questioning. The NKVD demanded confessions, and they would not stop until they got them. Sleep deprivation, beatings, starvation, every tool of torture was used. Most signed anything put in front of them, not because they were guilty, but because it was the only way to end the suffering. The charges were often absurd. A factory worker accused of plotting to assassinate Stalin, a teacher accused of spying for Germany, a soldier accused of sabotaging his own army. The truth did not matter, only confessions mattered. And those confessions became evidence, but even after confession, there was no salvation. Some were sent to gulag labor camps, endless miles of frozen Siberia, where prisoners cut timber in the snow, mined coal in the darkness, or starved in makeshift barracks. Survival rates were low. Disease, exhaustion, and hunger killed thousands every week. For others, the end came swiftly. A truck ride to a secret basement. A brief, scripted trial that lasted minutes. Then a bullet to the back of the head. Their bodies were buried in mass graves, piled one on top of another, covered with dirt as if they had never existed. But the most horrifying part was this. The arrests were not random chaos. They were planned. The NKVD had quotas. In some regions, local officers were told, "Arrest 5,000 counter-revolutionaries this month." When names ran out, they simply invented new ones. Entire villages could vanish. Teachers, farmers, doctors, soldiers, no one was safe. Imagine that. A government so consumed by fear and paranoia that it measured its power not by how many people it protected, but by how many people it destroyed. And for ordinary citizens, life became unbearable. They stopped speaking freely. They burned old letters. They hid family photographs, because even an innocent word, even a forgotten book, could be used as evidence of treason. The knock at midnight became the symbol of Stalin's rule, a symbol of terror so deep that generations of Russians would later say, "We learned not to laugh too loudly, not to whisper too softly, and never, ever to trust a friend." By the late 1930s, more than 1,000 people a day were being arrested across the Soviet Union. And still, Stalin demanded more. More enemies, more trials, more disappearances. The machine of terror had become unstoppable. And yet, perhaps the most chilling truth was that many NKVD officers themselves would eventually face the same fate. The hunters would, in time, become the hunted. But in the years of the Great Terror, one thing was certain. No one was safe. Not the soldier. Not the worker. Not even the closest allies of Stalin himself. Because in a land ruled by fear, loyalty meant nothing, and betrayal was always only one knock away. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union was no longer just a country. It was a prison. Every apartment building, every village, every workplace carried the same invisible weight. Silence. Conversations stopped mid-sentence if someone entered the room. Children were warned never to repeat what they heard at home. Even inside families, trust collapsed, because no one knew who might denounce them next. The NKVD didn't just target strangers. They encouraged betrayal. Neighbors reported neighbors. Workers reported co-workers. And worst of all, children were sometimes pressured to report their own parents. The result was a society where words became weapons. A careless joke, a complaint about bread shortages, even a sigh at the wrong moment. Any of these could be twisted into a crime against the state. Imagine living like that, a life where silence was survival, where even your thoughts felt dangerous. The scale of the terror was staggering. Entire professions were gutted. Writers, poets, and journalists vanished, accused of spreading anti-Soviet lies. Military officers, men who had fought for the revolution, were accused of treason. In one brutal purge, Stalin ordered the arrest and execution of the Soviet Union's most experienced generals. Marshal Tukhachevsky, a brilliant strategist, was dragged from his home and accused of plotting with Germany. There was no evidence, but evidence was never required. He was tortured until he confessed to crimes he never committed. Within days, he was executed, and he was not alone. By the end of the purge, more than half of the Red Army's officer corps was either executed or imprisoned. The very men who were supposed to protect the nation were wiped out by their own leader. Why? Because Stalin trusted no one. Not his generals, not his ministers, not even his closest friends. One by one, the men who had once stood beside him in the revolution disappeared. Some were shot in secret basements. Others were dragged before public trials, forced to read rehearsed confessions, accusing themselves of absurd crimes while cameras recorded every word. The message was clear. If Stalin could destroy his most loyal allies, then no one in the country was untouchable. For ordinary citizens, this deepened the terror. If powerful generals and ministers could vanish overnight, what chance did a farmer or factory worker have? The answer was simple: none at all. The fear poisoned every aspect of life. At schools, children recited Stalin's praises, even as some of their classmates' parents disappeared. At factories, workers hung portraits of Stalin on every wall, terrified that any sign of disloyalty might be noticed. Even in homes, people whispered Stalin's name as though he were listening from the walls. In many ways, he was. The NKVD had eyes everywhere. Informants sat in theaters, in schools, in union meetings. Some did it out of fear, others out of ambition. But the result was the same. Nobody knew who to trust, and trust was the first casualty of Stalin's terror. Yet perhaps the cruelest part was this: many of those arrested were never enemies of the state. They were loyal Soviets, farmers who delivered their crops, teachers who taught the next generation, soldiers who bled for their country. But loyalty didn't matter, because in Stalin's world, loyalty was temporary and suspicion was permanent. The purges left scars so deep that even decades later, survivors remembered the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the echo of a car door at midnight, the sudden silence when a friend's name was mentioned. By the end of the Great Terror, historians estimate that nearly 1.5 million people had been arrested. Hundreds of thousands were executed. Millions more were sent to the gulags. But beyond the numbers, there was something even more devastating. The Soviet Union had become a nation built not on unity, but on fear. Fear of the knock at the door, fear of speaking too loudly, fear of thinking too freely. And in that atmosphere, Stalin's power was absolute, because terror was no longer just a tool. It was the very foundation of his rule. The year is 1953. The iron grip of Joseph Stalin over the Soviet Union is as tight as ever. But time is running out. His health is failing, and whispers of succession swirl through the marble halls of the Kremlin. Yet, even in his final years, Stalin clings to his favorite weapon of power: fear. The Soviet people live in an atmosphere of constant paranoia. Neighbors avoid making eye contact. Friends speak in coded phrases. Families eat dinner in silence, terrified that a careless word could bring the dreaded knock at the door. The NKVD, renamed, reorganized, and reshaped, still functions as Stalin's ever-watchful shadow. Its leaders compete for his favor, while secretly fearing they will be the next to disappear. Inside Moscow, a new wave of terror begins to rise. Stalin accuses Jewish doctors of plotting against him. He whispers of vast conspiracies poisoning the state. Citizens once again brace themselves for arrests, interrogations, and deportations. It feels as though history is repeating itself. But this time, something unexpected is about to happen. On the night of March 1953, Stalin collapses at his dacha after suffering a stroke. He lies helpless for hours, surrounded by guards too afraid to summon help without explicit orders. The dictator, who once held absolute command over life and death, now clings desperately to his own. Within days, Joseph Stalin is dead. For the first time in decades, a flicker of hope spreads through the Soviet Union. But hope is a fragile thing. In the power vacuum that follows, Stalin's loyalists move swiftly. Lavrenti Beria, the ruthless master of the secret police, steps into the spotlight. He promises reform, whispers of releasing prisoners, of loosening the chains of fear. Some dare to believe him, but Beria himself is despised, even by Stalin's inner circle. He knows too much, has blood on his hands, and wields the NKVD like a dagger. Within months, his rivals turn on him. In a shocking reversal, Beria is arrested and executed. The man who once decided who would vanish is now erased himself. Across the Soviet Union, the machinery of terror begins to creak to a halt. Political prisoners are quietly released. Families who had long mourned in silence suddenly see their loved ones return. Broken, scarred, but alive. For the first time, whispers of truth begin to emerge. Survivors speak of the gulags, of the interrogations, of the brutal winters endured with nothing but rags for clothing. Stories of mass graves seep into the public consciousness, shaking the foundations of Stalin's carefully crafted myth. And yet, the scars remain. Millions are gone, swallowed whole by the void of Stalin's purges. Their names are whispered only in private, their fates left officially unacknowledged. The Soviet state, eager to move forward, hesitates to fully confront the horrors it inflicted upon its own people. Instead, it buries them beneath silence, rewriting history in the process. But history has a way of resurfacing. Decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, archives are opened. Documents reveal the scale of the nightmare in cold, bureaucratic language. Signatures authorizing arrests, lists of names crossed out, quotas for executions. The world finally learns the staggering truth. Millions had vanished, not by accident, not by chaos, but by systematic design. To this day, the legacy of Stalin's secret police casts a long shadow. In Russia and beyond, debates rage over how to remember the man and his crimes. Some still cling to the myth of Stalin as a strong leader, the one who defeated Hitler. Others, especially those whose families were torn apart, see only the blood-stained truth. A dictator who weaponized fear, turning neighbors against neighbors, erasing lives with the stroke of a pen. And so, the story of Stalin's vanished thousands is not just about the past. It is a warning, a reminder of how quickly freedom can vanish when fear becomes the language of power, a reminder of how silence can become complicity, a reminder that history's darkest chapters are written not only by those who commit evil, but by those too afraid to speak against it. Because when the knock comes at midnight, it's already too late.